She stood quietly at the back of the funeral. No tears, no speeches, just silence. The crowd had gathered to honor a Hollywood legend, her father, Tony Curtis. But for Jamie Lee Curtis, it wasn't just the loss of a star. It was the complicated farewell to a man who had barely been a father. She once said he was never really there. Born into cinematic royalty with both parents shining in the golden age of Hollywood, Jamie's life seemed destined for brilliance. But behind that glimmering legacy lay fractures, divorce, abandonment, emotional distance. The woman the world knows as a sharp-witted actress, an Oscar winner, and an advocate for healing, was once just a little girl waiting for her father to show up. And when her mother, Janet Leigh, passed away years earlier, the pain was different, deeper, more raw. Because that was love. That was presence. That was home. This is not just the story of a Hollywood icon. This is the story of a daughter, two stars, and the complex love that fame could never quite fix.
Jamie Lee Curtis was born on November 22, 1958, in Santa Monica, California. Though the City of Angels would never quite feel like the safe haven that name promised. From the very beginning, she was wrapped in the glow of two of Hollywood's brightest stars. Tony Curtis, the matinee idol of the 1950s with his impossibly handsome face and devilish charm, and Janet Leigh, the Golden Girl, immortalized in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. But fame, as Jamie would come to understand, was never a synonym for family. Her childhood was fractured almost before it began. When Jamie was just 3 years old, her parents' glamorous marriage crumbled into a public divorce. While the tabloids buzzed with gossip and glitter, behind the headlines stood a little girl already beginning to live without the presence of a father and clinging to a mother who was trying to hold everything together. She was shy, awkward, uncertain of her place in a world that expected greatness from the daughter of screen legends. School was a struggle, and college barely held her attention. But there was one inheritance she could never outrun: performance. It was in her blood, whether she wanted it or not. Then came 1978. At just 19 years old, Jamie Lee was cast as Laurie Strode in Halloween, a low-budget horror film that would go on to redefine the genre. The Scream Queen was born. But even as audiences hailed her for her chilling vulnerability and defiant strength, Jamie was quietly fighting her own demons. The fame she inherited and the fame she earned never quite filled the emptiness left by her fractured family. She could have stayed in horror forever. It was easy, predictable. But Jamie Lee wasn't meant for comfort zones. In the decades that followed, she transformed, tackling action in True Lies, comedy in A Fish Called Wanda, and drama in Everything Everywhere All at Once, the latter earning her an Academy Award over 40 years after her debut. Off-screen, she became an outspoken advocate for addiction recovery, a cause close to her heart, and wrote a series of children's books, perhaps hoping to give other children the comfort she rarely felt. Her life was never just about spotlight. It was about survival, reinvention, and the quiet, persistent hope that someday she could reconcile the glitz of her last name with the aching need for unconditional love. Because no matter how many standing ovations she received, there remained a little girl inside her, one who still remembered the silence after her father walked away and the warmth of a mother who stayed. Before she was Jamie Lee Curtis, she was simply the daughter of Tony and Janet, two names that glowed in lights far brighter than any nursery night lamp. But behind the silver screen personas of her parents lay two very different legacies, one shaped by devotion, the other by distance. Tony Curtis, born Bernard Schwartz in the Bronx, clawed his way from poverty into superstardom. He wasn't handed anything. His charm, his chiseled features, and his undeniable presence made him a heartthrob of the 1950s. Films like Some Like It Hot and Spartacus cemented his status. But Tony's relationship with fatherhood didn't mirror his cinematic charisma. After his divorce from Janet Leigh in 1962, Tony drifted from Jamie Lee's life like a ship that forgot its port. He remarried multiple times, fathered several other children, and found comfort in the adoration of strangers, not the quiet responsibilities of parenthood. Jamie once said with chilling clarity, he was not interested in being a father. It wasn't bitterness, it was fact. The rare moments she did spend with him felt more like fan encounters than family time. She wasn't angry, she was invisible. In contrast, Janet Leigh was a fortress of grace. Born Jeanette Morrison, she skyrocketed to fame with her haunting performance in Psycho. But beyond the scream, she was a woman who knew sacrifice. After her divorce, she didn't remarry in search of a headline. Instead, she chose a stable, quiet life with stockbroker Robert Brandt, a man who would become Jamie's stepfather and her steady presence. Janet raised Jamie and her older sister Kelly with dignity and discipline. Fame didn't enter the front door of their home. There were no Oscar statues on the dinner table, no red carpet rituals. Janet tried to give her daughters what she had never had: emotional safety. She cooked, she showed up at school plays, and she never let Jamie forget that real life happens far away from the cameras. Jamie would later recall how her mother had a way of making everything feel okay, even when money was tight, even when Jamie struggled in school, even when Hollywood came calling too early. Janet was there, calm, watchful, protective. She taught her daughter the value of authenticity in an industry obsessed with illusion. But their bond wasn't just built on motherhood. It was built on survival. Jamie grew up watching her mother navigate fame, ageism, and the decline of roles for older women in Hollywood. She saw how Janet aged with quiet strength, never chasing relevance, never succumbing to bitterness. That grace would later shape Jamie's own choices, the roles she accepted, the causes she championed, the words she put into her children's books. Still, even with the shelter of her mother's love, Jamie carried the weight of her father's absence. In interviews, she sometimes smiled when mentioning him, but it was the smile of someone recalling a ghost, not a father. Tony would occasionally call, send a letter, attend a premiere, but the connection was always fractured, too brittle to bear real weight. What haunted Jamie wasn't anger. It was the silence that followed every time she reached out. The unanswered phone, the forgotten birthday, the quiet acknowledgement that no matter how much celebrity could repair the absence of a father's daily love. And yet she never turned her back on either legacy. She embraced the brilliance and brokenness of both her parents. She knew that her mother's tenderness and her father's detachment both shaped the woman she became. Because to understand Jamie Lee Curtis, you must first understand the two stars who birthed her. One who showed her how to be visible, and one who taught her what it means to be overlooked.
It was October 3rd, 2004, when the phone rang. Jamie Lee Curtis was on the other side of the country, miles from the house where her mother, Janet Leigh, lay in a quiet room, her body frail, her breathing thin. The woman who once stunned the world with a single scream in Psycho was now silenced by something far less theatrical: vasculitis, an inflammation of the blood vessels that slowly, cruelly dimmed her life. Jamie had seen the signs: the weakening voice, the fading energy, the slow, almost poetic retreat from the world. But no matter how much you prepare, nothing quite steels you for the moment the world loses its shape, the moment your mother takes her final breath. She flew in, heart clenched, too late to say goodbye. The room smelled of lavender and sadness. The nurses had already covered her with a soft white sheet. Her hands, once so full of strength, were still, clasped together as if in prayer. Jamie stood silently, her hand trembling as she placed it over her mother's. "Thank you," she whispered, "for every single thing." That loss shattered her. Janet Leigh wasn't just her mother, she was her anchor, her reference point, her blueprint for how to live in the storm that is Hollywood. In the months that followed, Jamie disappeared from the spotlight, her interviews laced with a grief that lingered just beneath the surface. When she left, she later said, "I lost my map." But fate wasn't finished testing her. 6 years later, in 2010, Jamie received the call no child ever truly expects, even when the relationship has long been distant. Her father, Tony Curtis, had died of cardiac arrest at the age of 85. It wasn't the same grief, not the same wound. This one was messier, more complicated. She hadn't been close to Tony in decades. In fact, their relationship had never truly healed. The final years of his life were filled with marriages, headlines, and, perhaps most telling, a will that left Jamie and all her siblings out completely. There was no final letter, no apology, no gesture of closure, just silence, even in death. Jamie didn't speak at the funeral. She attended, dressed in black, her face composed, her eyes unreadable. To the world, it was the goodbye of a daughter to her legendary father. But inside, it was the final confirmation of a truth she'd long known. She had never truly been his priority. Still, she mourned. Not just the man he was, but the father he never became. In the years that followed, Jamie refused to villainize him. She didn't cast blame, didn't rage in public. Instead, she chose a different path, one of quiet reconciliation with the pain. She said, "He was who he was, and I am who I am because of it." Because sometimes loss isn't just about death. It's about the absence that lingers long before the final breath.
The sun was barely rising when the cars began to arrive at Forest Lawn Memorial Park. It was October 13th, 2004, 10 days after Janet Leigh passed away. The air in Los Angeles was warm, but around the chapel there was a stillness that felt sacred. Friends, family, and a few close colleagues gathered, not as fans of an icon, but as people mourning a woman who had lived with extraordinary grace. Jamie Lee Curtis arrived early. She wore no veil, no dramatic gown, just a navy blue dress her mother had once said looked quiet and kind. She clutched a folded note in her palm, one she'd written the night before, full of memories, fragments, and unfinished conversations. The chapel wasn't filled with Hollywood glitz. There were no cameras, no flashing lights. Jamie had insisted on a private service. No awards, no film reels, just music, flowers, and love. She spoke softly to the crowd. Her voice trembled only once when she said, "My mother taught me that kindness is louder than applause." Then, without theatrics, she placed the note on top of the casket and bowed deeply. For a moment, no one moved. Time froze. Her mother's favorite song, "Que sera, sera," played quietly as the casket was lowered. And in that moment, Jamie Lee Curtis was not a celebrity. She was a daughter, raw, vulnerable, alone. 6 years later, the tone couldn't have been more different. Tony Curtis's funeral took place on October 4th, 2010, also at Palm Eastern Cemetery in Las Vegas. It was open to the public, complete with a star-studded guest list. The press had already lined up hours before the ceremony, eager to catch one last glimpse of the matinee idol's departure. There were photos of him from the 1950s displayed on easels, dashing, youthful, magnetic. One of the screens played a silent montage of his greatest film scenes. But amid the celebration of his life, one thing was noticeably absent: Jamie's voice. She attended, yes, but she did not speak. She did not linger. She arrived late, sat in the back, and left before the final words were said. No speech, no letter, no tearful tribute. Only a single white rose placed gently at the foot of the casket before she disappeared behind the chapel's exit doors. There were rumors, of course, that she had been cut from his will, that their relationship had never healed. But Jamie never confirmed or denied any of it. What she gave the world that day was a silence louder than any eulogy. 2 funerals, 2 departures. One filled with warmth, closure, and gratitude. The other, a quiet acknowledgement of a bond never fully formed. In the years that followed, Jamie Lee Curtis rarely spoke about either event in detail. But those who knew her said that something shifted after both losses. A layer of armor, a stillness behind the eyes. Because sometimes the final goodbye isn't about the words we say. It's about the truths we carry with us long after the graves have been covered.
The loss of both her parents left Jamie Lee Curtis in 2 entirely different kinds of mourning. Her mother's death carved a visible wound. Jamie withdrew from public life for months, refusing interviews, appearances, even roles. She described it not just as grief, but as losing the roof of the house. Janet Leigh had been her protector, her example, her anchor, and now that anchor had drifted away. For a time, she felt unmoored, drifting in a life still glittering with success, but empty of direction. But Jamie didn't drown in that sorrow. Slowly, deliberately, she turned inward. She began writing again. Not screenplays or memoirs, but children's books. She poured her emotions into stories meant to comfort, meant to guide, meant to nurture. Books like Tell Me Again About the Night I Was Born and Big Words for Little People weren't just tales. They were conversations she imagined having with her mother or with the child she had once been. In interviews, she spoke often about healing, recovery, and the importance of showing up, values her mother had embodied. She became an advocate for addiction recovery, a path shaped not only by her own past struggles, but perhaps also by the pain of disconnection she had carried since childhood. The loss of her father, however, didn't break her in the same way. Instead, it confirmed what she had long suspected, that some absences never close. There was no sudden epiphany, no dramatic reconciliation in the final days. Jamie Lee Curtis died as he had lived in her story, charismatic, complicated, and distant. Jamie processed his death not with tears, but with reflection. She forgave him, not in public, not in fanfare, but in her own quiet way. She once said, "I understood that he gave me what he could, and from that I've learned to give what I never got." Perhaps that's why she's so fiercely present now. In every role, every cause, every sentence she speaks on grief and addiction and childhood. Her life became the answer to the loss. Because where her parents once stood, one loving, one absent, Jamie Lee Curtis chose to become whole.
In the world's eyes,
Jamie Lee Curtis was born lucky, the daughter of Hollywood royalty, a natural successor to fame. But what the world didn't see were the quiet nights of loneliness, the longing for a father's voice, the gentle strength of a mother who carried everything alone. From the ashes of abandonment and the warmth of maternal love, she built herself, not as a replica of her parents, but as someone who refused to let pain define her. She found peace not in legacy, but in truth, in showing up, in being the kind of parent, partner, and person she once wished she had. Because in the end, fame fades, awards gather dust, but the real legacy is how we love, and how we carry the memory of those who shaped us, for better or worse. Do you remember when you first saw Jamie Lee Curtis on screen? Did you know the heartbreak she carried beneath the spotlight?